Welcome to the world of survival horror. My name is Berquito, and I am here because life finds a way. Today, I bring you the 7 levels of Resident Evil games. The 7 levels video concept is one that I stumbled upon because my algorithm decided to show me the 7 levels of rappers, the 7 levels of fantasy, and the 7 levels of film. These are 3 of my favorite things, so I felt I had to indulge in it, and also thought it'd be fun to bring in my own personal knowledge of something that I greatly love, which is Resident Evil. I also understand that the 7 levels or circles is something that derives from Dante's Divine Comedy, more specifically the 9 circles of hell that are featured in Dante's Inferno. For some reason, some people either decide it's going to be 7 or 9 circles of hell, but for those who are literature aficionados, I decided to at least point this out in case you maybe want to mention that in the comments down below. This is essentially a brief discussion and list compiling the Resident Evil games and where they stand from levels 1 all the way up to level 7. I did use the visible color spectrum as the other videos did to place these games and lists of what they are accordingly, more specifically from the lower wavelength to the higher wavelength. Those who are science nerds, you already know what I'm talking about. Roy G. Biv, essentially. I found a way that I organized this list to be fairly accurate, considering that I've been spending the better parts of my life on Resident Evil communities and message boards, so I have a pretty good understanding of how fans perceive each game in the series. So, let's begin. Level 1. Nobody asked for this. This is essentially the games that fans don't really necessarily like or care for. Basically, Umbrella Corps, Resident Evil Resistance, Reverse, Gun Survivor 2. These are the games where we're like, Capcom, what is this? Like, nobody wanted this, nobody cares. They're just not great experiences, and they either kind of suffered from like rushed or even delayed development cycles, and it's very clear that there's a little bit of a lack of understanding in what Resident Evil is supposed to be with these kinds of games, considering that Umbrella Corps specifically was released as an anniversary project, and so was Resistance and Reverse. These games were released to kind of celebrate the all-encompassing Resident Evil franchise when they didn't really hit the nail whatsoever or really well enough for people to fall in love with these projects. Now, I will say I did spend a lot of time playing Reverse, and while that game was just kind of okay, it could have been fleshed out, but it's like they basically just gave up on it. They gave us new characters, but they didn't really give us new maps. They only gave us like 2 or 3 maps, and they didn't try to flesh anything out. It's kind of a shame, because had they had the same level of care and consideration for being online projects, perhaps it could have been something to take off, but instead they just threw these out, or at least it felt that way, and they were pretty tone deaf with the fan base. And no, Resident Evil 6 is not at the bottom of this list because that's going to be later. These games are just something nobody really cared or wanted, and they generally either get shut down or the player base is just dead at this point. That's all there is to it. Moving on to level 2, not made for the core audience. So these are games that are basically the mobile games, the pachinko games, the browser-based game, the weird Biohazard Vendetta VR player experience. It's only a Japanese PSN store, but it's there. You can buy it and download it and play it if you really want to. These necessarily aren't games that core audience people are really ever into, although in saying that, some of these games on the list are actually worth checking out, like the Resident Evil Generation game, for example. That's actually a pretty fun little experiment, but in saying that, it's like, okay, that exists. And then you also have like the Game.com, Resident Evil 2, and all these other weird kind of experiences that nobody really wanted. And I guess if you wanted to, you could include, some canceled games in this, but overall, I feel like the canceled games don't really fit well on this level, considering that they're canceled projects. So yeah, more or less, these are just the games that just kind of exist, either for promotional needs, or perhaps it's just something that they just wanted to put out there. It's strange to me, because as many Resident Evil mobile games that do exist, I'm pretty surprised at the fact that they have only ever shown this much promotion in the upcoming Resident Evil Survival unit. And then I guess I would also include that weird Resident Evil 2 rail shooter that's being made, which to my opinion does not look great at all. It just doesn't look exciting or fun. It even looks lesser than like Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles, but you know, that's just maybe my own opinions. Bottom line, this level is basically just like, these are just here. Resident Evil fans usually know about them. They're not really made for us. They just simply exist. Moving on to level 3, these are average releases that are worth playing. So this is actually where we start getting into the more consumable forms of Resident Evil video games. This is where I would put like Operation Raccoon City, Umbrella Chronicles, Darkside Chronicles, Resident Evil Survivor, RE Gaiden, Mercenaries 3D, just those weird like kind of spin-off titles that just exist. And they usually have cult followings and people that just kind of die on the hill that they really enjoy and love these games. I have played and I do enjoy most of the games that are on this level, but in saying that, I don't really think that they're anything to write home about. Some of them are just really cool ideas that just weren't executed well. More specifically, I would probably give that to the Umbrella Chronicles, Darkside Chronicle games. While they do exist and they're part of part of their story is canon, not all of it is canon. They're just kind of okay. It's just, you know, I grew up playing House of the Dead and a lot of other rail shooters that are just like super good. And there's also Star Fox and like Panzer Dragoon. It's just the Chronicle games, while they're fun, I don't find myself falling in love with them. I just think they're okay and they're serviceable. And this is essentially that list of games. Generally speaking, though, that's my opinion on what these games are. These games do have pretty strong cult followings. Specifically, I would say Resident Evil Survivor and Gaiden. Those two games are interesting and they're worth checking out. That's really all there is to say. Level 4, the cool ports. So this is actually where we start to get into the realm of Resident Evil ports that exist that are worth playing, that some people actually prefer over the original versions, like Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 4 for the Wii, Resident Evil Revelations for the Wii U and the Switch, Deadly Silence for the DS, the Resident Evil 2 and 3 for Dreamcast, the PC versions, etc. Even the Sega Saturn and Resident Evil 1. These are all ports that exist, and while I wouldn't say they are better than the original releases of these games, these ports all offer something really unique that aren't in the original version, and that's why they're very interesting to check out, because you might not really like Sega Saturn Resident Evil. Its loading times are abysmal and it has some weirdness to it. It's just this anomaly that exists, and for those who haven't experienced these ports, they really should, especially the Resident Evil 2 64 port, which I have right here in my hand. This is a game that is kind of a miracle port and was actually developed by Angel Studios, which later became Rockstar. Think about that for a moment. And saying that, this is what this level is. It's just cool ports. They're not necessarily better than the original experiences, but some people will swear by them. I'm a huge fan of all these ports. They're almost like a peek into an alternate timeline of what Resident Evil could have become, especially the GameCube versions of Resident Evil 2 and 3 that have these improved visuals and everything fits on one disc for the most part. They're very interesting because they run so well, and they were also the base ports that were originally used for the Seamless HD mods before people started to really hack and modify the PC versions of these games. And the reason why I love to talk about them or bring them up is because the GameCube versions of all the Resident Evils, and the reason why the exclusivity happened with Resident Evil 0, 1, and Resident Evil 4 for the GameCube was during this era of time where Capcom made a deal with Nintendo to release all Resident Evil games on that same platform. And as we know, with Resident Evil 4, and that just didn't happen. It got re-released on PS2, and then it got re-released on PC, and I mean standard PC, not Steam. It got released on the Wii and everything else. So that's basically what all this encompasses. And again, these are all versions of the games that have very unique features that just aren't anywhere else. Like the motion controls in Resident Evil 4, for example, are phenomenal for the Wii. The Rebirth mode that's only on Deadly Silence for the DS, that uses the DS mic and touchscreen interfaces to make this really awesome version of the game. I feel like you guys are understanding what I'm putting down here and what I mean by this, so this is why this is its own level. Moving on to level 5, Divisive games. So this is the level where these are games from here on out that are all pretty damn good. However, the Divisive games, and I'm going to list them, there's a wider Divisive, I feel like y'all will be able to comment down below, which are Resident Evil 0, Code Veronica, the Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. Some of y'all might put Resident Evil 6 at a lower level or a lower tier in terms of Resident Evil games, but the sales don't lie. Not to mention that in hindsight, RE6 has seen a lot of more playability, and a lot more people have reflected more upon it and saying how cool a lot of stuff in Resident Evil 6 is, especially with all the content that was released and all the DLC and the online and the multiplayer, and how the story functions, and you can play with friends simultaneously. And there's a lot of cool stuff in Resident Evil 6, and mechanically speaking, it is a pretty solid game. I would say the biggest flaws that RE6 possess are how the story is presented and the game's level design being kind of shared. Like, I understand that they wanted to integrate this kind of tag team element to the game where you would have people come in and join your game and do all these kinds of things, but unfortunately you kind of retread a lot of the same levels in the game, and there's a lot of automatic sections and turret sections that I wouldn't say are exciting. But overall, I don't think RE6 is a bad game. RE6 is really just a poor representation of what Resident Evil is, and so as a result, I can also say the same thing about Resident Evil 5. But Resident Evil 5, for me personally, I enjoy this game as this tag team, co-op, two-player action shooter, but that doesn't sound like Resident Evil either, does it? And that's why I would more or less say that Resident Evil 5 and RE6 are truly divisive entries and not necessarily games that are actually bad, because they're functional and they're fun to play and they're cool and they're good in that sense, but they do not represent Resident Evil well. Now, Resident Evil 3 Remake, that's a game that I could argue that represents the series well enough, but a lot of people feel that it's a poor representation of what Resident Evil 3 is, and to a degree, I agree. I know that rhymes. I guess I'm fucking Dr. Seuss all of a sudden. But besides the point, it's one of those things where Resident Evil 3 Remake falls short in some levels, but also exceeds in a lot of things, where it's a mixed bag for a lot of people because the game is not a true to form remake, nor is it close enough to its source game to where it reminds people of the original game. Although I do feel that a lot of people misremember the original Resident Evil 3, and it's funny that people are starting to praise RE3 in hindsight because of the remake, whereas like Resident Evil 3 was never a game of the original classic trilogy that people ever loved more than 2 and 1. But it's interesting how time has shown that people are more open to what that game originally was trying to do. Thus, it now creates this weird sort of paradoxical review of the game. Resident Evil 3 first came out, I was there, and people did not like the game at all. There were some people who loved it and stood by it, but they felt that its identity of the series was lost, as well as what later on with Code Veronica, and also with Resident Evil 0, which is why I put Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0 on a divisive game list, because RE0 truly is, there is like no middle ground. You either like it or you don't. I enjoy the game, but in saying that, I'm not deluded. I understand why people are like, oh, this is dumb, or this is frustrating, or this is like a weird choice, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And the same with Code Veronica. Code Veronica has a lot of choices that kind of hinder an experience, but then again, it's like, I remember this time period where people were like, oh, I really enjoy the Resident Evil games because they don't hold your hand and they don't ever try to tell you what to do. And yet the same reason why people complain about Resident Evil 0 and Code Veronica is mostly due to factors of the game where they just kind of withhold information from you, and those are usually the main cases. It's funny because a lot of people even complain about item boxes in Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, and then with Resident Evil 0 remove the item boxes, everyone was like, nope, forget it. Now, I love every Resident Evil game to a degree, as if they're like my own children, but it's one of those things that I think about where I'm like where is this really coming from? Are people really viewing these games with a critical eye? And how many of these people who either hate or like the game have actually played it themselves? That's something that I think about, considering that a lot of the complaints of older Resident Evil games usually are their tank controls. I would argue that's kind of what makes those games what they are. We could be here all day splitting hairs and coming to agree to disagree, compromises and whatnot, but at the end of the day, there's a reason why I put these specific 5 games on the divisive list, because regardless, I love all these games, but I understand why people don't. Level 6 is the underrated gems. This is where I include the likes of Resident Evil 8, Resident Evil 3 Original, Resident Evil Dead Aim, Revelations 1, Revelations 2, and also Resident Evil Outbreak. Now, in recent times, there has been a lot more love for the original Resident Evil 3 and Outbreak. But I find it funny how it took people getting to know what these games are to finally have like an opinion of them or go to play with themselves. That's just how anything works. It's like in our cultural zeitgeist, like we kind of almost cherry pick what the champion here and there, you know. And as a wrestling fan, I get it. Like there are certain times where we want you to go away for a while. We want this person to come in and grow big. I feel like right now Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil Outbreak are kind of reaching a new level of understanding that people are like, oh no, these were excellent games. Resident Evil 8, I'm surprised because that game's marketing really sold itself, but a lot of people kind of really only seem to care about like Lady D and some elements of the story. And then of course there's Shadows of Rose, which is a really amazing DLC expansion that's worth exploring. But Resident Evil 8 for a lot of people just kind of felt like a lesser RE4, which is kind of weird because while the gameplay is a little similar, I wouldn't say that the games are exactly like one another. They're different enough and they have a unique approach to what Resident Evil is supposed to be, I guess, in spirit. But Resident Evil 8, I find myself enjoying that game every time I play it. I feel that the game has kind of reached an underrated status. Now, when Resident Evil 3 first came out, some people weren't really feeling it. They just didn't really seem to understand that you had to actually like craft ammo or how you handle Nemesis. And so there was this kind of limbo status that RE3 original had. Actually, when you really give Resident Evil 3 a fair shake, you know, this is actually an excellent game that stands alongside Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, which I agree. I think Resident Evil 3 is an excellent game. In fact, in many ways, it's my personal favorite of the classic Resident Evil games. And then you have Resident Evil Dead Aim, which was a really unique game because it's also the Ford gun survivor game, but you could actually use a mouse to play Resident Evil Dead Aim, which is very cool. I don't think people really understand that's an option. So if you ever play Resident Evil Dead Aim on your PS2, or even if you decide to hook it up with the emulator, you can actually attach your mouse to the aim controls and you can more or less enjoy the game a bit better for what it is. And then Revelations 1 and 2, which for the longest time, even I had kind of marked these games off, but the more I played Revelations 1 and Revelations 2, I realized these are pretty excellent games. And these games they're just good. They're solid. Like, I wouldn't say they're like a perfect 10, but they're like a nice 8, you know? And that's kind of where all these games are. They're kind of like an 8 in the series, the 80% of goodness, or Metacritic scores, I guess, if you really want to go that far. And then, of course, there's Resident Evil Outbreak, which you just had to be there. Resident Evil Outbreak was a lightning in the bottle when it was released, and me and my friend Carl both played it a lot. Man, Outbreak was just this magical game you could play online, and now you can do it as well. There's fan servers, but the feeling's a little different. I guess it was a little different back in the day since there was no actual voice chat in the game. That was a feature. And so we had workarounds where we would use certain voice commands and character commands to kind of supply what a command was. Now I'm itchy right here. We would find workarounds with how to do that by Jim says this means I have this item and vice versa. But I feel like if Outbreak were to be released today in an actual official capacity, it would benefit more from having proximity chat. It is not a game you would want to have with a Discord group. Man, look at me, I'm sweating. Louisiana heat is not kidding, bro. But overall, yes, these are those games that are underrated gems, and thankfully I feel that in time, if there's any games from this list, from this level that's going to be in the level 7 within the next year or two, it's going to be Resident Evil 3 Original and Outbreak for sure. For sure. For sure. What am I saying? What am I doing? Now, moving on to the final level, these are the undisputed crown jewels. These are the games that if for some reason you don't like, you are in a very vocal minority. I think it goes without saying you should all know what the games are on this list, which are Resident Evil 1, the original, Resident Evil 1 Remake, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4 Remake, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and of course, Resident Evil 7. I don't really feel as if these games can be dethroned. These are the absolute crown jewels of the Resident Evil franchise. They are just everything that Resident Evil should be or should always amount to be. They're always well beloved and praised by fans for obvious reasons. I mean, if you play these games yourself, you would understand, like, man, these are just it. Especially Resident Evil 1 Remake. If you've never played Resident Evil before, what are you doing? This is the one you should play first. Or just play the OG 1 and 2, because they're just excellent games. And they're widely available now on GOG and PC for a very cheap price. They were on sale for a while. And of course, you have the Resident Evil trilogy that's on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. The games that are on this level are definitely the games where their legacies kind of speak for themselves. And there's really not much else I could say about them outside of just, yeah, they are just really that good. So for this particular video, I had to record some RE4 for the Wii, and I just couldn't stop playing it. I just always remind myself like how good that game actually is every time I play it. And it's the same with Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 1. That's pretty much all there is to it. If you like this list, if you don't, I don't care. Say whatever you feel. I feel this is honestly just mostly my opinion, but this is all based on experience that I've had since I've been playing these games since I was 4 or 5 years old. So being a big part of the fan base and now even being part of communities that do speed runs and stuff for these games and challenges and charity runs, you know, I've definitely have kind of considered all those opinions from a shared collective fan base that who I've been paying attention to my entire life. That's pretty much all there is. I hope you all enjoyed this video. You can always find me streaming here and there over at twitch.tv/PedoquitoFuete. That is twitch.tv/PedoquitoFuete. I mean, the more you also can support this and watch and share, subscribe, whatever, the more I'll be able to do this. So for any and all support is welcome, and I appreciate everyone who is watching. Thank you so much for your time. Feel free to comment, share, or subscribe, or don't. It's your life. Do whatever you want. I'm out. Peace. Do you like both Resident Evil and raising money for a good cause? I have good news for you. BioRan for Mind is a charity event and group that aims to raise money for mental health treatment and awareness. It features many people who love playing, speedrunning, and challenging themselves playing Resident Evil titles in the various randomizers and mods. There are so many players who enter and take part in the event, from big speedrunners to the smallest underdog streamers from your block. It's all for fun and for a very good cause. Again, that is BioRan for Mine, with the number 4. Please go give them a follow over at twitch.tv/BioRan for Mind. I will leave a link down in the description below. Do you want to prove your worth and your ability at playing and being good at the classic Resident Evil games? Well, I got news for you. Go and follow Resi Runs. Resi Runs is a group built by a community of speedrunners who host races, mostly focusing on the original Resident Evil classic trilogy. It's lots of fun, and you can see some of the best players in the community go head to head, as well as getting to experience an overall damn good time. You can find them over at twitch.tv/ResiRuns. That's runs with the letter Z at the end. Twitch.tv/ResiRuns.